Lesson 58 Act 1. Introduction. In this lesson, we explore a fundamental helper used in React testing called Act. Its purpose is to ensure that any pending React updates are fully processed before we perform assertions. When we test user interfaces, many interactions and rendering steps queue asynchronous work within React. If we make assertions too early, we risk reading an intermediate state that does not reflect the final result of the interaction. Act gives structure and reliability to our test flow by forcing React to flush all internal updates before we continue. 2. Await Act, async Act fn. When we prepare a component for testing, we wrap its rendering and any subsequent interactions inside an awaited Act call. By awaiting it, we ensure that React completes all relevant work triggered during that interaction. This makes our tests behave more like they would in a real browser environment, where updates settle before the user sees the result. Note: although using Act directly may feel verbose, many testing libraries offer utilities that already wrap their helpers with Act, making the experience smoother. Still, understanding Act is important because it reveals how React manages updates internally. 3. Reference. 3.1. Await Act, async Act fn. When writing user interface tests, we normally think in terms of interaction units. Rendering a component, simulating a user action, or triggering a data fetch are all typical units of work. Act ensures that all the updates associated with such a unit are completed and reflected in the rendered output before we evaluate the result. The name Act comes from the arrange Act assert pattern, which describes the typical structure of a test: prepare the environment, perform an action, and then write assertions based on the expected outcome. React recommends using the asynchronous version of Act. Even though the synchronous version may work in simple scenarios, React's internal scheduling makes synchronous use unreliable. For this reason, the synchronous form will eventually be removed. 3.2. Parameters. The Act function takes a single asynchronous function. Anything that triggers updates within that function, whether synchronous or asynchronous, is scheduled for processing. React gathers all those updates into an internal queue, processes them together, and ensures the final rendered state is ready by the time Act completes. 3.3. Returns. Act does not return a value. Its role is purely to orchestrate update completion. 4. Usage. When testing a component, Act is essential for making reliable assertions about its output. Without Act, there is always a risk that React has not yet fully finished processing updates. 4.1. Rendering components in tests. To test the initial rendering of a component, we wrap the rendering logic inside Act. This guarantees that the component mounts, its state initializes, and any effects run before we check the container. Without Act, effects might still be pending, which would cause unpredictable results. Using Act makes the test environment behave more like how the component behaves in a browser, where changes appear only after React has committed its updates. 4.2. Dispatching events in tests. In many tests, we want to simulate interactions such as clicking a button. These interactions typically trigger state changes, effects, or layout updates. By wrapping the event dispatch inside Act, we ensure that all consequences of the action are finalized before we read the result. One important detail is that dispatching DOM events only works correctly when the container is actually attached to the document. Otherwise, browser APIs and React behaviors tied to the document environment will not run correctly. Testing libraries can help simplify this part of the setup. 5. Troubleshooting. I'm getting an error. The current testing environment is not configured to support Act. Using Act requires enabling a specific global flag that signals that the environment is prepared for Act-driven updates. If this flag is missing, React warns that the environment has not been configured correctly. To fix this, the global flag must be set to true in the test environment configuration. Some testing tools, such as React Testing Library, already set this flag automatically so the user does not need to configure anything manually. Note: when using frameworks or testing libraries that integrate tightly with React, this configuration is often handled for you. However, when setting up a custom testing environment, adding this global flag is essential.